Deep within the secretive halls of defense firms the world over, a race is underway to develop and field the most advanced and capable air-to-air missiles ever to see the sky. Russia, China, and the United States in particular now all claim to have air-to-air weapons in service with so much range that they can reach targets the launching aircraft can't even detect, relying instead on secure data links that can funnel target information to the missile from an ever-expanding kill web of sensors and platforms operating all throughout the battle space. Of course, this air-to-air missile race is running in parallel to another combat enterprise that's only recently made the leap from science fiction to battlefield reality. AI-enabled collaborative combat aircraft, or CCAs, fighter drones, designed to operate alongside the world's most advanced fighters, extending their sensor reach, engaging targets on the pilot's behalf, and turning every individual fighter into an entire formation unto themselves. And then there's DARPA's Longshot, a concept that somehow stands out as unique even among the ever-growing list of exotic new drone platforms in development and testing today. At first glance, Longshot may look like any other large air-launched cruise missile. In fact, it's even powered by the same turbojet that you'll find in cruise missiles being fielded by European allies. But this unusual platform isn't just a missile. It's a missile that carries and fires its own air-to-air missiles. Or as General Atomics, the platform's manufacturer, puts it, Longshot isn't a missile so much as it's an air-launched fighter. These drones can be launched from aircraft to close with incoming targets from multiple vectors, possibly tripling the effective range of air-to-air weapons like the AIM-120 AMRAAM, while helping to flood contested airspace with an overwhelming mass of targets and shooters. And this wild idea is now making its way toward flight testing this year. So let's dive back into Longshot, how the program is progressing, and why it just might be crazy enough to work. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. On Tuesday, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, put out a press release with a long-awaited update on what they call an unmanned air-launched vehicle capable of employing current air-to-air weapons, significantly increasing engagement range and mission effectiveness. Now that is a mouthful that may be better articulated by General Atomics Vice President for DoD Strategic Development, Patrick Mike Shortsleeve, in a statement that he gave the War Zone last year when he said, quote, "It's called Longshot, and that effort is really, if you think about it, it's an air-launched fighter." And I've got to admit, that does have a much better ring to it than my best effort the last time I covered this program, where I described Longshot as giving your missile some missiles. Now, Longshot is gearing up to begin flight testing before the end of this year, and it even has its own official X-plane designation now as the X-68A. As DARPA explains, Longshot has matured into a platform-agnostic air vehicle that can be launched from fighters like the F-15E and F-15EX, from bombers like the B-52, or from any number of other potential hosts, carrying and deploying its own air-to-air missiles, namely the AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, or AMRAAM, at targets that could be hundreds of miles away from the launching platform. In fact, DARPA even goes on to specify that Longshot could even be deployed via cargo aircraft with palletized launch systems like Rapid Dragon, making it possible to launch what Joseph Trevithick over at the War Zone rightfully described as a counter-air screen, to rapidly engage a large volume of airborne targets. Now, according to DARPA, the Longshot platform has already completed extensive wind tunnel testing, as well as tests of its weapon release and parachute deployment functionality, and we'll get back to that later. But for now, it's important to understand that Longshot isn't the only air-to-air basket that the Pentagon is placing eggs in lately. The still very secretive AIM-260 program meant to provide American fighters with a new beyond visual range weapon that fills the same basic form factor as today's AMRAAMs, but offers a big boost in range, has already been in at least limited production for going on 2 years now, with both the Navy and Air Force earmarking hundreds of millions of dollars for AIM-260 buys in their 2026 budgets. And then, of course, there's the Navy's already in service AIM-174B Gunslinger, which we've discussed a bunch of times before because it's likely to be the furthest reaching air-to-air weapon in Uncle Sam's arsenal for some time to come. As an air-launched variant of the incredibly capable SM-6 Interceptor, the AIM-174 has the potential to reach targets that might be more than 300 miles, or roughly 482 kilometers out. Though it's important to note that figure has not officially been confirmed. Now, these weapons are meant to offset perceived advantages provided by new extreme-range air-to-air missiles being fielded by geopolitical rivals in Russia and China. Russia's R-37M, as one example, is an updated iteration of the R-37, which, like many advanced Russian programs of recent years, actually started development prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, but only muddled its way to service in 2019. According to reports, the R-37M is said to carry an additional rocket booster that might extend the weapon's range all the way out to a claimed 186 to possibly even 248 miles. That's 300 to 400 kilometers. But it's worth noting that Ukrainian fighter pilots like Major Vadim Vorishilov are quick to dispute these claims. And I'll actually quote him directly now. Quote, "The range of the R-37M of 400 kilometers exists only in the minds of the propagandists on the Russian Zvezda TV channel." Now, Russia, of course, does have a long and storied history of exaggerating the capabilities of its military technology. But these weapons are being employed regularly from Russian fighters as a form of area denial defense, effectively lobbing them into Ukrainian airspace to force Ukrainian fighters to maneuver and shake that inbound weapon rather than continuing on whatever their assigned tasks may be. And the painful truth of the matter is, even at half of that claimed 400-kilometer range, the R-37M would still boast a further reach than the most advanced AMRAAMs in service today. But the real pacing challenge for long-range air-to-air missiles is obviously China, whose PL-15 was actually the impetus behind America's AIM-260 program in the first place, back when the PL-15 first entered service in 2016, with a claimed operational range of up to 124 miles, exceeding that of the AIM-120D employed by America's top-line air superiority fighters. Now, that weapon has since been eclipsed by the much larger PL-17, and this missile, which stretches a whole lot longer than either the American AIM-174 or the Russian R-37M, seems to be similar in concept to the AIM-174, and that it might have actually been developed out of a surface-to-air missile interceptor rather than coming from the China Airborne Missile Academy that's responsible for developing most of the nation's air-to-air weapons. Now, like the R-37M, China's PL-17 has a claimed maximum range of 400 kilometers, and based on its size and weight, it has a pretty good chance of getting there. Of course, as we've discussed on this channel several times before, comparing the maximum engagement ranges of missiles that are meant for use in beyond visual range engagements is, well, to be honest, kind of a rookie mistake. The underdisclosed reality of talking about maximum missile ranges is that these figures don't just include how far the weapon can travel under power, but also how far it can coast after depleting all of its fuel while still feasibly hitting a sluggish and slow airborne target like a tanker or early warning and control aircraft. Long-range air-to-air missiles don't just travel straight toward their targets like you might think, but instead, they usually climb to much higher altitudes while their engines are still burning. And this allows the missile to use the combination of potential energy, or altitude, and kinetic energy, or speed, that it gains while traveling under power to continue closing with a target well after all of its fuel has been expended. The legendary AIM-54 Phoenix, as one good example, was usually launched at well under 50,000 feet, but it would rapidly climb to better than 100,000 feet while its engines were burning to make sure it had enough altitude to coast all the way to bombers that were more than 100 miles out. That is to say that launching any air-to-air missile at a maximum range target is more than just a roll of the dice, and it is anything but a certain kill. Even if weapons like China's PL-17 could sustain its top speed of Mach 4 through its entire flight, it would still take about 4 minutes and 54 seconds to cover its claimed maximum range of 400 kilometers. And that is a really long time for your target to get out of a missile's way, especially for more dynamic aircraft like fighters. Every course correction or flight path adjustment the missile makes has to come at the expense of fuel, airspeed, or altitude. So if the missile has to expend all three of those just to reach its target, well, it's not going to have any energy left to maneuver and close with that target once it finally gets there. As a result, the much more important range metric to consider when it comes to air-to-air missiles isn't maximum range at all, but rather what we commonly call the no-escape zone, or the NEZ. The NEZ is the range in which the missile is still carrying enough energy, usually fuel, that a target simply can't escape it through maneuver alone. Of course, almost no nation discloses the NEZs of their missiles, so despite being the right metric for us to actually compare, we usually don't have that much to go on. But this is why I've often sung the praises of the MDBA Meteor, which may only offer a maximum engagement range of around 120 miles or so, but because it's powered by a throttleable ducted rocket ramjet, it can slow the pace of its fuel burn for longer-ranged engagements, allowing it to retain fuel and, in turn, energy to maneuver and close with dynamic targets like fighters further along in its flight path. And as a result, the Meteor is, at least in my opinion, more deadly than similar weapons like the American AMRAAM or the Chinese PL-15 at those ranges. And as luck would have it, the Meteor is also one of the only modern air-to-air weapons with a commonly cited figure for its NEZ. The MDBA actually markets the Meteor for having the largest NEZ of any missile of its class, but it's probably a lot shorter than you might think at a reported 60 kilometers, or roughly 37 miles. Now that means even with that throttleable ducted ramjet slowing its fuel burn, the Meteor's no-escape zone may still only be about 30% of the weapon's reported maximum range. Any distance beyond that, and the chances of scoring a hit begin to decline. And, of course, a shot within the NEZ is still not a sure thing because there are countless other variables, like missile countermeasures, that can step in and rain on your parade. But nonetheless, if we were to give other weapons that same 30% of maximum range no-escape zone metric, which importantly would be overly optimistic for missiles using more traditional rocket propulsion, weapons like the AIM-120D and PL-15 would fall in the 30 to 35 mile range. That's about 48 to 56 kilometers. While bigger weapons that can't be carried internally by stealth fighters, like the PL-17, might have a no-escape zone of 75 miles or 120 kilometers, and the Navy's Gunslinger might be able to claim an NEZ of as much as 90 miles or 144 kilometers. But to be clear, this is a vast oversimplification that probably overestimates the no-escape zones for all of these weapons, but might be closer for China's PL-15 and PL-17, which leverage dual-pulse rocket motors specifically to expand their NEZs. Now, that was all a very long and number-filled way of saying that even the longest-ranged air-to-air missiles in service today probably are not as capable as the fights on Reddit would have you believe. The truth of the matter is, air-to-air engagements in the 21st century are all but certain to be much more common at beyond visual range than in close quarters, but those engagements are still a lot more likely to happen at under 100 miles. Heck, I would argue probably under 70 miles, than they are much further out. And it was with this exact understanding in mind that I imagine DARPA kicked off the Longshot program in earnest back in 2021, when it began phase 1 of the program by soliciting design concepts from General Atomics, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin for a, quote, unmanned air-launched vehicle capable of employing current air-to-air weapons, significantly increasing engagement range and mission effectiveness. Now, the concept, of course, is pretty simple. Create a way to launch air-to-air missiles at closer ranges and thus closer to their no-escape zones, all without increasing risk for that launching aircraft. In March of 2022, DARPA selected General Atomics' design to move on to Phase 2 of this program, focused on maturing it toward prototyping with Phase 3, which was focused on fabricating the flight test vehicle, seemingly kicking off sometime the following year in 2023. Now, General Atomics, of course, has a long history of fielding advanced drone platforms, ranging from the MQ-1 Predator, made famous in the early days of the global war on terror, to the YFQ-42 CCA fighter drone that's in testing with the Air Force today to fly into combat alongside advanced fighters. In fact, Longshot itself was even described by the president of General Atomics' Aeronautics Division, Dave Alexander, as a good candidate for Increment 2 of that same CCA program, which may be focused on lower cost or attritable drone assets that can be used for higher risk missions. And that actually offers us a glimmer of insight into Longshot's technical prowess, or maybe even its lack thereof. DARPA has stated that the Longshot flight test vehicle is being equipped with a parachute for controlled landings after it expends all of its fuel, but that parachute is strictly intended for testing. In combat, Longshot will deploy its onboard munitions and then either be shot down itself or crash into the ground. Of course, I know that will come with concerns about the onboard technology being reverse engineered by a crafty adversary who comes across a largely intact Longshot drone, but it seems clear that General Atomics and DARPA have designed this platform with the goal of keeping all the really advanced targeting and computational work off board. In effect, Longshot is little more than an air-breathing cruise missile with a two-way data link that allows it to draw updated target data not just from the launching aircraft, but from an entire network of assets in theater. As such, it doesn't have to carry its own radar seeker or really any other kind of pricey sensor package. Instead, it simply absorbs data from elsewhere and relays it to the AIM-120s it's carrying. Or as the Pentagon put it, quote, "With the mission systems architecture, Longshot will be able to communicate with line-of-sight systems that can detect threats, such as multi-role fighters and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, as well as beyond line-of-sight systems that provide targeting information to engage enemy air assets." As a result, the existing inventory of AIM-120s from fourth-generation platforms will be effective at longer ranges. To some extent, you could think of Longshot as really little more than an air-breathing jet booster for its AMRAAM payload, using its single Williams WJ-38-15 turbojet to propel the drone to high subsonic speeds, maybe even as high as 0.95 Mach, to either fly out ahead and close the distance with incoming threats, to loiter in defense of an aircraft, or to converge multiple weapons from multiple vectors on a single target to maximize the chances of a kill. Once it launches those AMRAAMs, all you've got left is a common turbojet, a data link, and an empty payload bay to steal secrets from. The price point for Longshot has not been disclosed, and honestly can't even really be effectively calculated without a sense of potential production numbers. But General Atomics has been clear that it is cheap enough to be considered expendable. Longshot could also make it possible for non-stealth fighters to provide direct support to forward-advancing stealth fighters at longer ranges than ever before, while allowing those stealth fighters to preserve their few onboard weapons for more pressing targets. F-15EXs carrying Longshots armed with AIM-120s could launch those payloads from hundreds of miles behind an F-35, F-22, or F-47. Allowing the Longshot to close the majority of the distance before launching its own AMRAAMs at a target designated by those stealth fighters. When launched from bombers, Longshot could not only support fighter operations in the area, but with a sufficiently networked kill web, could serve as disposable bomber escorts, scrambling out toward incoming threats and engaging them with air-to-air missiles before they could ever even reach the launching bomber. And in perhaps the most wild potential use case, a palletized launch system for Longshot, like Lockheed Martin's Rapid Dragon, could allow a small number of cargo aircraft to deploy dozens of long-range air-to-air missile-packing Longshot drones practically at once, flooding enemy airspace with air-to-air threats too potent to be ignored, forcing fighter and air defense systems to engage them, depleting interceptors, munitions, resources, and manpower before a single Longshot even scores a kill. But despite the pretty conspicuous benefit Longshot could provide, it is still true that the Longshot concept is not necessarily the most economically efficient one. Rather than making disposable drones to carry missiles out ahead of fighters and bombers, it might be more efficient to just build larger missiles with greater range, or to build more reusable drones to carry those missiles. But the reality of warfare is not ever that simple. The US is indeed pursuing all three of those approaches in separate programs, with collaborative combat aircraft or fighter drones of varying price points and capabilities in the works, and a long list of new extreme-range air-to-air missiles under development. But you don't go to war with the gear you just invented. Broadly speaking, you go to war with the gear you've got. The United States doesn't disclose the total number of air-to-air missiles that it has in its inventory, but it's safe to say Uncle Sam has a pretty large number of AMRAAMs in his closet. All told, Raytheon has produced more than 20,000 AMRAAMs of varying iterations since they started in the early 90s, both for America and a long list of foreign buyers. And while at least 5,000 have been expended to date, there are likely to be thousands of these weapons still in Uncle Sam's hangars right now. And Raytheon is actively expanding AMRAAM production as we speak to 1,900 units per year. That is to say that even a decade or more from now, there will all but certainly still be a lot more AMRAAMs available to commanders in the fight than there will be AIM-260s or AIM-174s. And in some cases, those AMRAAMs may well be called on to engage targets much further away than their classified no-escape zones would allow. Fourth-generation fighters may be called on to support 5th and 6th-gen platforms in hotly contested airspace, or any number of other sets of circumstances could arise that force leaders on the battlefield to make creative use of the assets that they have to make mission. In a large-scale fight against a nation like China, Longshots carrying AMRAAMs, or even other weapons further down the road, could be a vital element of combined air and surface saturation attacks, with Longshots pouring into enemy airspace alongside more advanced combat drones, and radar decoys, and stealthy cruise missiles, and loitering electronic warfare assets, and higher-end air-to-air weapons, all meant to take on more pressing threats, and a whole lot more. These are the sorts of situations Longshot was built for, taking what you've got and using it to do something it never could before. Or at least, that's the plan. Longshot was initially meant to begin flight testing more than a year ago now, but despite DARPA singing the program's praises, that first flight is now slated to happen sometime later this year. But delays notwithstanding, while it may not be the warfare panacea everyone's always looking for, Longshot does seem like a pretty important step toward the future of air warfare, which is rapidly beginning to look a lot more like a high-speed hornet's nest of sensors, shooters, and weapons that blur the lines between each. So here's hoping that flight test goes well, because I, for one, can see a lot of very practical use cases for a system like Longshot. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.